It's August 14th, 2023, and welcome to another episode of the Peru Channel Podcast. I'm your host, Philip, and in this podcast, I try to share things I've learned from the perspective of someone who's spent more than 18 years visiting and living in Peru. I'm not one of those experts on social media who want to tell you exactly what Peru is like when they were only here for a few days, so I started this podcast as a way to talk about the realities of being here. I not only live here, but I travel extensively around the country and closely follow current events. In this episode, I want to talk about 4 questions that I get asked constantly about Peru. I try to think of what questions I hear the most from people wanting to know about Peru, and the list really became pretty long. So at least for this episode, I shortened it to the questions that I get asked most often. When is the best time to visit? Is it safe in Peru? Is Machu Picchu really worth it? And the question I hear most often, what made me want to live here, are today's topics. At the end, I also have an important update regarding Machu Picchu tickets that has been announced a few days ago and will affect many visitors to South America's most famous tourist destination. One of the most common questions that I hear is, what is the best time of the year to visit Peru? I'm going to give you kind of a roundabout answer because there really is no best answer to this question, and it's all going to come down to when is best for you and your preferences. But I hope I'll give you some information that'll make it easier for you to make a decision for yourself. Peru is a very large country with 3 drastically different geographic regions: the coastal desert, the high Andes Mountains, and the Amazon rainforest, including 90 microclimates, which is more than just about anywhere else in the world. Because Peru is not far from the equator, that means it has tropical climates in the Amazon rainforest, and also because it is home to much of the Andes Mountains, it also has high altitudes nearing 7,000 meters, which means extremely cold weather extremes. Just to give you a little example of these extremes that you can find here, I was coming back from Machu Picchu about a week ago, and literally less than 20 kilometers went from traveling through the high Amazon rainforest to passing just beneath alpine glaciers. If you're going to visit Lima or anywhere along the coast, there's no doubt that South American summer is the best time. Winters tend to be gray and ugly, and while not particularly cold, the ocean winds and humidity make for a less than pleasurable experience. Summers, however, are usually gorgeous with little rain since it's a desert. Temperatures are warm but temperate and never cold even at night. It's interesting in the mountains, especially the southern mountains around Cusco, how different are the seasons, though recent global climate change has undoubtedly affected the normal pattern somewhat. The rainy season in Cusco generally runs from approximately November through March during the summer, but even then it means that the skies are for the most part only overcast, keeping the afternoon temperatures moderated. Really heavy or long-lasting rains aren't very common. Mornings tend to be a little cool, but when the winter comes, the temperature quickly drops overnight and frequently is near freezing by sunrise. The good thing for a lot of visitors is winter in Cusco is also the dry season, and the afternoon sun can warm things up to where it's frequently warmer than even in the summer. Just be aware that as soon as the sun goes down, or even on the rare cloudy days, it's going to feel quite surprisingly cool. While winter from April through September is the busiest tourist time of the year in Cusco and Machu Picchu because it matches up with vacation time in the northern hemisphere, along with the dry season, January through March is also an amazing time to visit Cusco and the mountains. The rains are more common, but they're really not that much of a problem. And in the summer, everything is so much more colorful compared to the winter when things are dry and brown. As I briefly mentioned before, global climate change is having an effect on Peru just as it is on the rest of the planet, meaning that general patterns are beginning to change, so generalizations don't apply quite as much as they did even a few years ago. Still, at least for now, you can have a reasonable expectation that things will stay as described whenever you visit Peru. But know that the possibilities for changes and even extremes are much more likely now than they have been in the past. One question that comes up quite a bit and is very much on the minds of everyone who visits Peru, especially over the past year, is whether it's safe or not. This is a really confusing topic as there are extremely mixed comments all over social media for which outsiders have a very hard time evaluating the motivation or the sources for posts on social media and even on mainstream news. International news this year has been heavily concentrated on covering the protests across Peru where around 60 people have been killed and hundreds injured in conflicts with police. Earlier in the year, there were extensive roadblocks of major highways, leaving thousands of passengers stranded for as much as a week all across the country. Airports were attacked by protesters and some were even shut down. For example, in Juliaca, the airport was shut down for a couple of months. Even Machu Picchu has been closed for a short time this year because of threats from local villagers. Well, this was certainly not a good time. It's long since passed. There were some protests last month in July, which included some smaller confrontations with police, but they didn't last long, and right now, at least, there's absolutely nothing to be concerned about as far as protests or riots or anything that would even inconvenience travelers. The good thing about protests in Peru is that they are not directed in any way at tourists, though the collateral effects of roadblocks can seriously affect your travel plans. Personal safety, just to be honest, is never a concern unless someone is stupid enough to try to join in the protests or try to force their way past the roadblocks. Though even there's a good chance those manning the roadblocks might eventually just roll their eyes and let a foreigner pass rather than trying to make a big deal out of it. Everyday safety in Peru is a completely different subject. In general, the country is quite safe and you shouldn't be concerned at all about visiting. For 99% of visitors, even more than that actually, you'll almost always be in places that are probably safer than where you came from. As always, it's important to be conscious of little things just like you would be in your home city or country. Things like never leaving your phone or your backpack or anything of value sitting around unattended, even for a second, is something to keep in mind. It's just never a good idea to wear expensive jewelry. Always remember things like having a cheap watch works just as well on a trip as does a Rolex. There are some cases of phone and backpack snatches happening from passing motorcycles in Lima and a few other places like Iquitos, but those frankly are relatively rare considering the millions of people who go around untouched every day. I've heard it's never a good idea to have a phone out in Lima, but I pass by countless people using their phones normally every time I'm there, so it must not be much of a concern. There are always some neighborhoods and places that are not recommended for visitors, but even they are not nearly as bad as they're made out to be. I've only felt threatened one time in over 18 years while walking in a dangerous neighborhood with an expensive video camera, which, to be honest, probably wasn't the smartest thing because I was walking alone. I was being followed by 3 young men who were closing in, obviously focused on my camera, but thankfully a family also saw them and invited me to come over and spend a little time while the 3 delinquents passed. To be honest, I simply have never worried even when walking in some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the country. Another question that seems to come up far more than I really expect is if Machu Picchu is really worth it. I think the basis for this is not really is Machu Picchu worth visiting, but is it worth the extra expense since it's not a cheap place to visit. For example, for a couple coming from the United States with no children, even a single one-day trip without using a hotel or lodging in Aguas Calientes is going to cost over $400, and that doesn't even include food. Paying for things like a guide and a couple of meals will increase the cost considerably. I first have to admit that I'm not an impartial person to ask about this because Machu Picchu for me has become my passion over the past few years. Despite the difficulty in getting tickets, I've still been to the actual site 10 times this year and 17 times last year. I have no idea how many times I've made trips into the Machu Picchu historical sanctuary itself, as most of the time I simply go to Aguas Calientes to visit friends and explore in the surrounding jungle. To me, Machu Picchu is like no other place in the world I've ever visited. It's essentially the only site of one of the world's major civilizations that exists very similar to what it was 600 years ago. Yes, there's been a good bit of reconstruction, at least 30% in the last 100 years, but for the most part, it still looks a lot like it did in the 15th century. The location, high on a jungle mountain ridge surrounded by the towering peaks and the deep Urubamba Valley far below, with the glaciers and snow-capped peaks visible not too far off in the distance, makes it one of the most spectacular sights in all the world. Unless you've been there on a clear day, it's really impossible to get an idea of just how breathtaking it is from seeing photos and videos on YouTube. Like so much of the Inca world, there's still an awful lot that we don't know for certain, and Machu Picchu is clearly no example. It disappeared in the rainforest after finally being abandoned sometime in the 16th century for a few centuries, before a handful of local people began simple farming again on some of its terraces in the early 20th century. Machu Picchu is also far more than the one site that almost everyone visits today. The former director, Jose Bastante, once told me that the sanctuary itself holds 60 specific Inca sites. Not single buildings, but significant sites with multiple constructions and multiple purposes. Some of the most incredible places in the entire Inca Empire surround Machu Picchu itself, as it's actually a very large complex of interrelated sites, most of which are still basically hidden in the jungle and known by only a handful of people. Machu Picchu is full of wonders that most guides know nothing about and understand even less. Representational carvings of important mountains, arrows carved into rocks, and stone faces that point directly to other distant places of great importance to the Incas, many of which can't even be seen from Machu Picchu, as well as countless direct alignments with points in and around Machu Picchu and related points in the surrounding region, are just some of the wonders that go unnoticed by almost everyone who visits. Lastly, whenever I meet someone new, one of the very first questions, if not the first, is what made you want to live here? Of course, that goes hand in hand with the implied question of why do I live here, because the reasons are inseparable and intertwined, as you might expect. As I mentioned at the start of the podcast, my history in Peru goes back to my first visit in May of 2005, 18 years ago. I was so struck by the place that I returned 2 more times that year, and at least once or twice every year after, until I came to live here permanently. Without getting into the details that I don't talk about much and few people know, my connection with Peru and Peruvians is very, very strong. I came to know the country in a way that few foreigners ever do, and developed a love of the place that many Peruvians have told me is deeper than most of their fellow countrymen. I knew at least a decade ago that Peru would be my eventual home. I didn't know when, but I was sure that it would happen, and looking back, I made sure that many things in my life made it possible for this to eventually happen. While I have a deep love for the geography of much of the country, especially the Andes and the rainforest, which everyone knows is my deepest passion, my love of Peruvians and the culture here is why I have no desire to live anywhere else. Many who visit or even come to live here have a really hard time understanding Peruvian culture. Like most places, it's extremely complex, with threads running through it that have been formed over many centuries. Peruvians have always been extremely patient, friendly, helpful, and warm to me. While there are always some people who don't quite fit into what I consider to be the norm for most, the vast majority of people in Peru are all of those things and more. Family here is extremely important, as are personal relationships. I never felt that was the case in most of the United States where I came from. Here, caring about your friends and family is what you do, not what you do when it's convenient or to your benefit. It's sad that so many foreigners who live here, especially many from the U.S., still have never learned that one foundational core of Peruvian culture. Before I close out this episode today, I want to let you know about the latest announcement regarding last-minute ticket availability in Aguas Calientes for Machu Picchu. As I talked about in the previous episode, this has been a major problem. Of the 4,044 daily slots available for visitors to Machu Picchu, 1,000 tickets were designated to be set aside for last-minute purchase at the Machu Picchu Administrative Office in Aguas Calientes. When long lines formed in the recent last month of domestic travel in Peru, many people who made the trip got in line in the middle of the night, still were not able to get a ticket. So because of that, changes have been put in place to hopefully ease the congestion and guarantee the availability of tickets. As of now, it's not possible to buy tickets online for Machu Picchu until September 26, when there's still only a handful of tickets available for the coming weeks. As of tomorrow, August 15th, it should be possible for those wishing to make a purchase at the last minute to go online and register to make a purchase in Aguas Calientes when you arrive. There was no announcement as to where this registration would be done, but I assume it will be on the government website where tickets purchases have always been done online. I'll put a link to this page in the show notes this morning, and I'll update it if necessary. It sounds as if this will basically act as a ticket reservation system that will be restricted to the person making the reservation for themselves or others like their family, using personal information, including your passport and identification information that's not transferable. This is a precaution against dishonest agencies that might start buying up all the remaining tickets in bulk and then reselling them. This can be done up to 48 hours prior, according to the recent announcement, and then your tickets must be picked up and paid for in Aguas Calientes. Multiple ticket windows are also scheduled to be opened in the Cultural Center in Aguas Calientes. I'm not exactly sure where this will be in the center, but there are ticket windows already in place in the upper section of the center, which is likely where you'll have to go. There was no word on whether the ticket windows at the Machu Picchu administrative offices will continue to operate. I have a feeling they won't, but I'll be going to Aguas Calientes tomorrow, where I'll try to confirm all of this there and update on the show notes page. As always, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe to or follow the podcast so you're notified when a new episode comes out, and share it with anybody you think might be interested. Audio-only episodes are also posted on my YouTube channel, appropriately named the Peru channel, under the podcast tab. Thanks again, and I hope to see you in Peru soon.